Christian Church. Welcome to the midweek message. This is your midweek message of the podcast of after the sermon from Sunday.
So this past week, we talked through Saul's conversion and his journey to becoming Paul. We talked about some pretty difficult things about how it would have been hard for the church to receive somebody who had done such horrible things to the faith family, to parents. It says that Saul drug men and women out of houses and led them away to prison. I looked up this passage in Acts chapter 26, verses 9 through 11. And this is Saul's own testimony about some of the things that had happened. But this is what he said about some of these events. So verse 9 says, I myself was convinced that I ought to do many things in opposing the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And I did so in Jerusalem. I not only locked up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priests, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. And I punished them often in all the synagogues and tried to make them blaspheme. And in raging fury against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. And so I know that I've heard different people, talk about Saul a little bit over the years as far as but do we know he actually killed people? And so whether it was by his hand or by his actions, his responsibilities brought about the death of some of these believers. And so in that regard, yes. And so it seems as though he says, that I tried to make them blaspheme. So there was a sense of leading the witness. There's a sense of, him casting his vote against people. So whether it was him himself or not, he was still a part of the process. And so when you're talking about this type of action against a group of people, for them to be able to receive someone like that into their faith community and then to watch them be raised up into a place of leadership, I think that gets pretty difficult. And so, one of the places that I talked about this past week was from Matthew when Jesus is talking about love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And so I just want to open that up to you guys a little bit as far as how do you think that this would play out today? How difficult would it actually be to see someone like this come into the faith community and be raised into a place of leadership? Possible? Impossible? What are the difficulties?
I think it would be most certainly possible if the community truly believes in God and what he does, and because of course you're trying to make disciples and everything. So I feel like it would be possible, but I'm not saying it's not going to be hard. Because I most definitely feel like it would be really challenging for some. Others maybe more than others too. But I think it's possible.
I think it's definitely possible. And I think that one of the things that would have to play into it would be like with Saul. I mean, even though it doesn't negate the actions that he's taken and the things that he's done, I mean, clearly something just absolutely major happened to this guy. Because he's done a complete 180, and he's literally preaching the thing he used to be hauling people out for. And so, I mean, if people were given the opportunity to actually witness him and talk to him and see that change having happened in his life, I think that it would be a lot easier. In today's society, we get our news from people, we get our news from our phones, we get our news and so hearing that Saul has changed would be a little harder to deal with, I think, than actually getting the chance to really engage him.
Yeah.
And I think that would be a necessary part of the process.
Yeah, so him personally being present is a huge part.
Yeah.
To see and witness for yourself, because it's kind of one of those, well, I'll believe it when I see it type of things.
Yeah.
I think that's very relevant. We also see before Barnabas is willing to stick his neck out on the line that the people are kind of hesitant, which I think is a natural reaction to be hesitant with someone like this.
Oh yeah.
But if you were to put it into like, I don't know, a category today, like what would it be like? Like what would it be like for a Saul to change? Like what imagination is that for you? That'd be like so and so becoming a faith follower and becoming radically proclaiming the name of Jesus.
I feel like it might be a little deceiving at first because you think them in a sense. So it's like either you're trying to make fun of our God, and so which would make it even harder because because the person that you originally knew didn't believe in God and wouldn't do anything for God or in that sense, in which case might make it harder because you have this image of them in your head and then they change, in which case you got to make a different image in your head that, oh, now they're a Christian now, so you need to help them in a sense to make more disciples.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one of the things that would have to be examined honestly is this person who has claimed to make this change. What do they have to gain from having made this change?
Mm-hmm.
Because if they are all of a sudden claiming to be a Christian and to follow Jesus, and it just so happens that that is going to help them politically, that's a concern. Whereas, if accepting Jesus is going to require you to give stuff up, well, it's very unlikely that you're going to fake a conversion that doesn't help you.
Right.
And so I think that plays into it a lot too.
There's a lot of evidence there because, I mean, Saul has nothing to gain from this conversion. He's already made enemies on the Christian side of the spectrum. And now, by making this decision, he's not guaranteed reconciliation with the Christians, but he is guaranteed to make new enemies on the Jewish side of the argument.
Yeah.
And so he has nothing to gain. He has everything to lose, as you're mentioning. And so that plays into it a ton. In fact, one of the things that is interesting about when he is in Jerusalem, he wants to go before the very Sanhedrin that had stoned Stephen. He wants to go before them and argue them to faith because he thinks he can. And so he thinks that now that he knows better, that he can actually do what Stephen was not able to do in a more thorough way. And he actually pleads with Jesus for him to be able to stay. And Jesus basically through the Spirit is telling him, you need to go because they're going to kill you. And so finally he does leave. But that shows how willing he was to be persecuted too. And like, while the immediate sense of justice for us might be lacking, like, man, why didn't this guy have to suffer for any of the atrocities? Edit. Why didn't he have to suffer for any of the atrocities that he did to the faith family? One thing we do know is that while he didn't suffer for those things, he did suffer. He ended up suffering much for the gospel.